I find myself both admiring and envying Paul Kingsnorth, the one of course being the shadow of the other. We deal in the same philosophical territory, the increasingly urgent intersection of nature and spirit, but he has taken these ideas to heights of influence and practical expression that I can only aspire to. Kingsnorth wants to move humanity closer to nature through rootedness, sacrament, local economies, and community, arguing that it is becoming nearly impossible to live a truly Christian life in a modern society. Its extractive and systematic techno-materialist basis, the machine, inoculates the soul, exacerbates inequalities, and destroys the planet. I share much of this conviction, yet I struggle with some of Kingsnorth's positions, namely his faith in spiritual revelation as a means of leading people out of the machine and into more sustainable lifestyles, and in visions of what a post-machine world ought to become. So I feel a strong need to work through Kingsnorth's ideas to trace both the convergences and divergences between his thoughts and my own, in order to crystallize my own position and perhaps to contribute to the broader vision we share. In doing so, I hope to show that diversity of perspective within this emerging movement is a source of resilience, that through our differing approaches, we refine and strengthen the spiritual and ecological imagination that we both seek to revive. Kingsnorth seeks a return to harmony with the animals, and draws inspiration from the wilderness saints, figures such as Saint Anthony the Great and Saint Paul of Thebes, who abandoned society to follow the teachings of Christ with clarity of heart. They believed that the corrupting patterns of civilization obscure our perception of divinity, whereas the wilderness reveals it through solitude. In their retreat and sacrifice of worldly possessions, the saints attained an instinctive harmony with creation, less self-conscious, yet more attuned to God, moving in the flow of divine order. I feel deep sympathy and admiration for this position, in a world where outer nature has been totally reduced to circuitry, a flow of energy inside a systematic network, and the inner nature of the mind, once held as the last bastion of ungovernable mystery, is increasingly being likened to and replaced by machines. Some countervailing principle of spirit had to re-emerge. The wilderness saints embody the most romantic strain of Christianity, revealing through the extremity of their devotion these equally extreme shackles that culture imposes on the human spirit through artifice and second-hand words. Nature is the necessary medicine, with its spontaneity and autonomy mirroring our inner natures, the instincts, intuitions, and feelings, all of which flow back to the original source of creation. It is what Erich Fromm termed the being mode, what David Abrams called the sensuous, what Jung located in the unconscious, and what Heidegger named Dasein, which sits in contrast to the possessive having mode of conscious ambition and control, which uproots being, dulls spiritual intuition, and fuels the machine. If we are to seek godliness of the purest form, we must seek it from the heart, expressions of spontaneity whose origins cannot be traced back to any human author, but only to the eternal wellspring itself. Such movements of the heart are rarely pretty or clean, like the savagery of nature, yet they can reveal to us our sin, the awareness of which is a prerequisite to moral growth, and they can ground us to the earth, humus, humility, soil, soul. It is all a question of control. Movement towards God cannot be prescribed, for God demands faith, and faith cannot live without mystery. Truth must stand beyond the precipice, calling from beyond the boundaries of the metropolis into the wilderness, and we step towards it. The extreme solitude of the saints shows plainly the individualistic strain of religion, that life is our gift, that is our cross to bear, our experience, our gnosis waiting to be revealed. Their life out in the uncontrollable wild emphasize that we do not create our own meaning, as we do with culture, the vessel of meaning, or with technology, the instrument of control. Instead, we search for it, we come upon it. Meaning exists within our soul before awareness touches it. just as an ecosystem exists before the building of a city. As long as we have done all within our power to sip at the fountain of dreams, then every sin becomes a lesson learned, each a purification of the soul upon the ascent to Mount Purgatorio, from whose peak springs the eternal well of paradise. Yet withdrawing from the machine and returning to nature is easier said than done, even for passionate admirers such as Kingsnorth and myself. Much of our shared reverence for the wilderness saints, I suspect, comes from our inability to meet them at their own level. As modern men, we cannot wholly detach ourselves from the world we grew up in, modern culture, and particularly technology. It's hardwired into us. Indeed, Kingsnorth admits that the lives of the wilderness saints are an extreme that few can attain. They embodied distilled expressions, symbols and archetypes of an idealized human yearning towards nature. Yet we are creatures of many modes of being, many archetypes, and as Carl Jung warned, to identify with a single archetype is to risk madness. This danger arises because we are fundamentally dualistic creatures, a fracture born of the fall from paradise that split into the multiplicity of human experience. Harmony with nature is the preserve of elves, Tolkien's thinly veiled angels, totally attuned to the world's divinity. Assigned as God's gardeners, we forever admire this angelic perfection, the ideals by which we orientate ourselves. Yet we also feel an uncanny discomfort in the ethereality of these divine automata, intuitive recognitions that we can never attain the ideal. We are tragically limited, as our fundamental relationship to nature as gardeners compels us to cultivate. To cultivate is to impose culture upon nature's innate harmony. Our relationship with nature requires some instrumentalism, whether reasoned through practice or passed down through tradition. To cultivate it is to stand outside of nature and to control it to ensure our own survival. The conscious awareness of our own weakness drives us to erect the walls of culture. In our world, grit is needed to form the pearl in the cloister of the self. The machine is in the garden. Kingsnorth has little to say in defense of modern civilization. I, on the other hand, cannot ignore that despite its soul-crushing aspects, it has rendered to us a lifestyle more materially and intellectually abundant than any other in history, and likely a lot more liberating than the lives of our subsistence ancestors. Spirit and economic development grow together, each expanding in scope and appetite. Degrowth, de-education, de-opportunity, these things all risk muting the spirit just as surely as excess corrupts it. It is near impossible at this historic juncture to compellingly argue that an intentional degrowth model is ethically and democratically salient, given how desirable our Western lifestyles appear to so many in the developing world. I feel very grateful for this life of mine, and I am rooted in this fading modernity in the same way that I see flowers emerging from cracked pavement. Although Kingsnorth has gone further than most in pursuing his ideal, moving to rural Ireland and living largely off-grid, I find his position marked by a certain contradiction. Kingsnorth acknowledges that the future world of natural spiritual harmony must arise freely from each heart, and not through the imposed mechanical systemization of corrupted society. Yet he employs those very systems to promote his own vision, by engaging in the online culture wars as an influencer. Somehow, Kingsnorth is simultaneously more off the grid than most, and yet more on the grid and reliant on it than most. The machine speaks his words, and his words want you to live a certain way. I would likely be the same in his place, but it strikes me that the machine should be used for personal expression while it's here, and that is a great gift. There's so much to learn about the world by being online. I accept both the good and the bad of the system together. As Hayao Miyazaki said, quote, "I think that technology is by itself neutral, innocent. It may be safe to assume that machines don't have souls, but in reality, people impart souls to machines." End quote. We fill technology with either good or evil, and so it's our responsibility to use it wisely. The machine dystopia magnifies our worst qualities, but there is a utopia twisted up in all this too. Kingsnorth striving for a better way, be it through teaching or through rekindling the divine intuition, admirable though it is, sprouts from the same fallen kernel which drives the machine to greater levels of control. The modern world is bound to a will to possess and improve, the having mode of Erich Fromm, a striving with deep Christian ties, the sermonizing missionary spirit to convert, to make the world better in God's image, and the need to separate out the good from the evil. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. In this effort, a broad desacralization of the natural world followed. Local spirits were prescribed, and the plural place-bound textures of numinous experience were thinned to gather worship into the church, setting the precedent for further desacrament in the technological age. That spiritual pursuit, summoned from the conviction of the heart, is intimately braided into the modern ideas of progress and self-worth. Seek the welfare of the city and pray to the Lord on its behalf. While the divine mandate, be fruitful and multiply, sits in stark tension with Kingsnorth's desired future, as it powers ecological destruction. The history of Christianity tends towards city and empire building, expansionary forces within the very apparatus Kingsnorth hopes Christianity will heal. As Wallace Stevens remarked, cathedrals are not built along the sea. Kingsnorth looks to the changing cultural climate as proof that we are waking up to his position. But how many awakening hearts will move in a direction against the machine? The recent reinvigoration of Christian values in American politics and in wider Western populism, for example, is entangled in the progressivism of the tech right, industrial rebuild agendas, climate denial, and pro-natalist policy drives. How cleanly we can separate out the romantic yearnings of a pure Christian heart from the top-down persuasion tactics of the system is uncertain. What is clear is that many self-defining Christians, at a minimum, actively support major components of the machine. Philosopher and psychologist William James, perhaps more than any other modern thinker, exposes the inescapable bind between spirit and modernity. A fervent believer in the spiritual basis of life, yet frail and approaching death, James was haunted by the rise of meaningless materialism at the turn of the 20th century. In the brief span between 1902 and 1907, he had completed both The Varieties of Religious Experience and Pragmatism, where he sought to confront that emptiness through philosophy. In Varieties, James mapped the forms of faith through a philosophical, psychological, and phenomenological lens. His aim was renewal, to show that the experience of conversion, mysticism, and moral struggle reveal a living spiritual dimension within human nature itself. The work became a cornerstone of the modern study of religion. Yet only 5 years later, in Pragmatism, his attempt to refocus lived experience around religious intuition would unexpectedly feed the very forces he opposed. Conceived as a spiritual philosophy, defining truth as that which works to enrich and sustain life, even if it was a material unknowable like the existence of God, Pragmatism was quickly co-opted into a doctrine of instrumentalism, truth as that which is useful, the logic by which modernity measures value through function, efficiency, and progress. Truth as a means to an end. Pragmatism would become the most influential book in American philosophy. What James had meant as a bridge to the spirit became a major algorithm of the machine. In an age defined by consciousness and control, the anxious intuitions of the spiritually minded are addressed with more thinking and more possession. I must conduct a thorough spiritual audit of the world and judge it. I must reassert what it means to be. I must possess being. Kingsnorth is no different. Our words are machine encoded. They sterilize and petrify. As Nietzsche says in The Twilight of the Idols, quote, "That for which we can find words is something already dead in our hearts," end quote. Only true poetry of the soul, that expression in reaching for the mystery, can escape it. Vice versa, any spiritual idea transmitted through modern systems risks being absorbed by them. The machine is expert at packaging the spiritual longing of some and redistributing it as consumable meaning for others through adverts, films, books, and online culture, just as it packages the natural resources that underwrite those sentiments. Nature becomes romanticized to the point of infantilization. Take Disney's harmless baby-eyed animals and the drift towards Bambiism, a return to the womb imaginary where nature exists only to comfort us. The prophetic elaborations of Tolkien and Lewis become blockbusters, the spiritual basis of which is recognized by only a few. For those few who do notice, the machine commodifies its own critiques, offering just enough spiritual satiation to keep us online and in line as the engine grinds on. As a result, I don't think any number of books, online discussions, or sermons will get us out of the machine. Kingsnorth is too bound up in the striving energy which he and the machine share. It's another kind of babble, more and more aspiring ideals to be possessed, more and more talk. It's not only Kingsnorth and Christianity which are caught up in this machine, but the spiritual potency of nature itself. The more we attempt a conscious return to harmony with nature, the more our reverence towards it will diminish. Think of the buttercup in Bladerunner 2049, the living symbol which unlocks the mystical, soul-revealing journey of the protagonist, a tin man adrift in a world where the machine has become the totality of existence. What kind of a tragic fallen order forces all of God's power to retreat into a single wildflower? And yet, what could be more brilliant than to hold all the universe in your hand? The symbol's enchantment points to a necessary tension of scarcity between nature and culture. For nature to feel spiritually potent, it must be under threat. This is borne out in data too. Populations in highly industrialized, nature-depleted countries show greater moral and aesthetic appreciation towards nature than those who live in wilderness-abundant, developing countries, where people often show active aversion towards nature and a desire to control it. In the time of Dante, when both Christianity and nature abounded, the great courtly poets praised the well-tended rose gardens, the hortus conclusus, as a place where noble lovers came to know God through pure romance. Cultivated spaces were guarded from the benighted wilderness beyond through fortifications of stone. To be exiled from the city walls was a fate worse than death. Nature meant anxiety, loss of identity, and sin, an indeterminable chaos where the ordered descent into hell itself would be a preferred option. In the 18th century, the aesthetic sense of the sublime, where the edges of reason confronted the awesome power of nature, could not have crystallized without the opposing Enlightenment desire to map, measure, and govern all of nature. Then, in the 19th century, the swelling poetry of the Romantics and its gratitude towards nature arrived only with an equal opposing force, the Industrial Revolution and the birth of the machine. From the theophanic intuitions of the Transcendentalists, the phantasmagorical American oracularism of Emerson, and the original experimentations in self-imposed simplicity of Thoreau, to the notion of wilderness as the preserve of the vital frontier spirit, from the birth of the national park system and modern conservation, to that most beautiful and defining crescendo of modernity, when Fitzgerald's imagination rose amongst the sparkling chrome canyons of New York, the first megalopolis, and he whispered.
Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights, except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the Sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away. until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. A fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Face to face, for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. F. Scott Fitzgerald.
All these crystallizations of nature, which we take for granted, were made thinkable because North America was the last continent to be conquered, the last inhabitable wilderness finally tamed. Ecology has been a scientific discipline for over 100 years, and ideas of human nature interdependence are millennia old. But true appreciation and understanding of our environment's life-supporting services and their economic value has only emerged amongst modern man within the last 30 years, as we have started to witness firsthand the consequences of environmental destruction. As culture expands, the felt sanctity of nature concentrates, and vice versa. The nature symbol compensates the artificial, leading us back to a connection with the uncontrollable God. However, in Kingsnorth's Christian township, in amongst the rising tide of nature, it will be the artificial which glows with spiritual wonder, like the ruin amongst the weeds. As we once more find ourselves in confrontation with the wild, our Western spiritual striving will cycle back, and from it the work of rebuilding the machine will begin again. We are in paralysis, pressed between a rock and a hard place. We cannot progress as the machine people desire, and yet we cannot regress as Kingsnorth desires. I think our new world will have to be forced upon us. It will have to come naturally, nature being the only credible referee, the only truly neutral third party. I think this is the only way to escape from the anxious striving in our culture, by letting go of control. The collapse of the machine, like all great civilizations before it, is inevitable, since it is fundamentally unsustainable, socially, economically, environmentally. The second-hand wisdom, the ideologies, utopias, systems and traditions we deploy to try and escape the machine will not work, because so much of it played midwife to the machine, or was contrived by the modern age. We go on with our destructive techno-systematic ways because, although the machine uprooted us, we have become bound to our new semi-artificial substrate. The Pequod is sunk by fixed obsession, despite being a refuge to every other kind of perspective which could correct it. And in so being sunk, it becomes a story worth telling by that sole survivor, the adaptable, mercurial Ishmael. Moby Dick, the great American myth and cornerstone of modern culture, contains within it the prophetic endpoint of our society, which we have still yet to grasp. That is why, after 174 years, it still retains all the vitality and mystery of its original conception, and will do until that reckoning point is reached. Apocalypse serves a vital function. Collapse can be pragmatic. In individuals, the controlling ego must sometimes dissolve to facilitate maturation through new ideas and feelings. In nature, ecosystems adapt to disturbance pressures in the environment and become dependent on them to maintain their function and composition. And amongst societies, the powers which ossify at the top and corrode the commons through tyranny or incompetence must be removed for freedom and innovation to return. Herein lies the wisdom of the seemingly paradoxical belief of the millenarians that the Antichrist would prelude the longed-for consummation, the second coming of Christ and the saints. The error of our ways must be burnt into the bone before we can change. That will only happen once it's too late to turn back. Be it a rapid collapse or gradual, we will have to experience it to respond to it. Only then will an awareness of the planet's ecological limits and our spiritual limits be branded into our being. The child must burn its hands on the stove to understand the teaching. As Adam took the apple despite God's warning, such is the tuition of the fallen creature. Apocalypse and Revelation share the same meaning, a pot boiling over, a tipping point. That is to say, collapse and gnosis are one in the same. The greatest epochs are not chosen. We do not simply decide to become something else. History arrives from outside. Our being is altered from beyond. Agriculture, sedentism, and civilization arose from post-glacial climatic changes. Christianity grew from the shock of the Incarnation, God on earth. The Industrial Age was ignited by Britain's abundant and shallow coal seams. Never before has a civilization operated at a truly global level. Never before has one amassed so much knowledge or rendered its people so utterly dependent on it. There will be a violent shake, as is inevitable when any tower falls, but the magnitude of violence will depend on the tempo of decline. Fortunately, unlike in earlier eras, we are not starting from a position of ignorance. The repository of knowledge, both physical and digital, make wholesale loss of knowledge less likely than in past collapses, potentially buffering against another centuries-long dark age. Accumulated ideas of human rights and morality, combined with a desire to preserve the peacefulness which we have been rooted in for several generations, may also serve as protection from violent disruption, assuming the decline is slow. When the dust inevitably settles, the few who remain will find themselves in a post-apocalypse unlike any before. Our great aspirations of mind and heart, once inflamed by and twisted up in the machine, will be fully and finally tempered by an Old Testament austerity forgotten these past few centuries. Freed from our original naivety and in full possession of our limits, the ancient ambiguity of our divine mandate, dominion over the earth, will resolve on its next meaning, stewardship. It will emerge naturally with a clarity which matches our ancient and medieval ancestors when they undertook the holy mission of subduing the wilderness in the name of civilization and the burgeoning human spirit. But this time the fire of divine purposefulness will instead be softened to a lilting ember. Although still only a subtle sense, the strange grace of our polarizing age is that in compensation, God has concentrated beauty in the ambivalent. The ambiguity we sense in Scripture today is purposeful. It is the infinite text, written to serve the whole of human history, and its meaning unfolds as we do. Cultivation is as true of the heart as of the land. It is sorting of the seeds and the mixing of the soils. In time, when history is ready to receive it, ambiguity will turn to clarity, which will be the clarity of ambivalence. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. God has moved from the all-illuminating sun to the syncretic haze, living like dulled silver, laying out the patinated wisdom of the next age. Ambition, freneticism, and fear of the kind experienced in the pre- and post-modern ages will never be seen again. The imagination of our successors will be so fundamentally altered that it will be incapable of conceiving the machine-like society. As Heidegger would call it, a shift in the truth of being, where duality diffuses not into singularity, but into mist. Kingsnorth resists boredom. He lays the blame on the machine for making God and nature dull, rendering everything bland and inert. I think they must be dull, in the best sense. Our being should be soothed into the monotony of nature's rhythms. From that, a permanent gratitude will emerge, and a yashike of soul-healing boredom. If each era is characterized by a mood, wonder for the Greeks, assurance for the medievals, anxiety for the now, then the next age will be mono no aware, quiet, wistful, and healing. Being will pale to ash white as the cabin stands, deserted on a beach, the consequence of an infinite course. The impenetrable Antarctic, the last wilderness in its perfect vacuum of hostility to us, its polar green, the color of ice and fire and solitude, will melt and mix with the black soot sands we have plumed across the earth, revealing the new being and a farewell to an idea, a horizon of melange, nature and culture, spirit and matter, east and west, conscious and unconscious. Not a dark age, but a grey age, set against the sapphire at dawn over the sea. The next phase of the ascent towards the Garden of Eden will be a contemplative odyssey amongst the ruins of our Promethean past. It will be a subdued clarity, beautiful in its embodied acknowledgement of restraint. Upon Ozymandias's solid gaze, half sunken, tyranny will mix with benevolence. The sense of gratitude they'll feel, the mystical nostalgia for the once mundane, those streetlights which lit up the world like stars, the peace they'll feel as the sea in its infinity laps the concrete superstructures, wearing away the poor facsimiles of the rich earth underneath. A world scattered about with plaintive gardeners, each set to tend a secret garden of their own. The new cultivation of culture, one led by intuitions of introversion rather than the exteriorizing intellect. The stratums of knowledge, tradition overlaid by systems thinking, upon which the new modest being emerges, supine forests of lichen. The new mind a chasmolithic synthesis of the anthropic landscape. Exotic weeds and fruiting trees lilt, their leaves falling along the quiet streets. The narrower the path becomes amongst the ruin and the ripening, the more that life will fill with intentionality. White anemones and wisteria vine, when autumn's aging arrives, will turn each built surface into Donatello relief. Rain will softly fall, fields will bloom, and kettles will brew. Hospitality, attention, and gratitude become the routines of community and work. Each will look back in serenity, seeing and feeling how our species rose to godlike dominion over the earth, only to have it dashed. Fatalism's grace in sage sallow green. Society as relationships among a few. Life as meditation on the beauty of passing things. Every passing day holds the transitory and enchanted moment and the all of human dreams. A return to slowness will occur, awareness no longer superior, nor alienated, nor naively unaware, but ready to rediscover everything of the ordinary through the pilgrim's gaze. Fog hanging like dew on the mountain trail will be punctuated by lone travelers, who like haiku come and go, brief, touching, gone. Experiencing becomes a recollection of old memories. Places are framed in living emptiness, a shroud of transient curiosity. The questions we once asked will never be answered, because they were never that important in the story. Instead, in a coalescing haze of place and being, the mind will be lulled into a silent contemplation, where tranquility and disquiet are one in the same. Few feats of veiled elegance will compare, none since those plum-blossom lords and ladies, their faded purple poetry raising temples from subtraction, the clarities of cultivated intuition moving ever closer to the celestial. Beauty now in its highest form, the form of every day, is in the mist and draping moss which hangs about the flagging bough, subdued glaucous needles, moon-pale bark, The dragons who hide their pearls of wisdom in deep-set ravines amongst scraggly pines floating in an infinite grey. Is it an animal which takes on the face of a man for a moment, or a carving on a stone from long ago? Will this world become the end, or will it continue quietly and soundly to grow?